if the speed step technology is enabled at the BIOS level. And of course it can also be boosted up higher because this is an unlocked chip. Finally, like the previous generation chips, or the majority of the previous generation Core i3 chips, the higher end ones, this does have a 4MB level 3 cache. Last generation's Core i3 6320 was the fastest i3 model we'd seen thus far. Clocked at 3.9 GHz, it got along quite well. That said, at a cost of around $160 US, one could argue that spending around, say, $20 more on the Core i5 6400 was a much smarter investment. Anyway, we'll talk more about that later in the video. For now, let's talk about testing. Since the 200 series boards are still under NDA, we decided to test using an updated Z170 motherboard. The ASRock Fatality Z170 Gaming K6 Plus sits proudly in our Core i7 6700K test machine, and with the latest BIOS revision supports the 7350K. So we swapped out the 6700K and got to it. As you might imagine, the i3 7350K isn't exactly slow at 4.2 GHz, but I was keen to see how much higher the chip could be pushed. Using the Thermalright AXP200R CPU cooler, I reached a 100% stable overclock of 4.8 GHz. Not bad, but not amazing either. This overclock was stable using 1.3 volts, and temps never went above 65 degrees. For those wondering, I was able to boot into Windows with the chip as high as 5 GHz, but it failed to pass the more stressful tests. The 7350K enjoyed a memory bandwidth of 32.8 GB per second in our Z170 test machine using DDR4 3200 memory. This is slightly more bandwidth than the Skylake processors had at their disposal, despite using the same configuration. Using Cinebench R15, let's take a look at the single and multi-threaded performance of the 7350K. At the stock 4.2 GHz frequency, it roughly matches the multi-threaded performance of the much-loved 2500K, which is of course a true quad-core processor, albeit an almost 6-year-old one now. Thanks to that high operating frequency, the single-threaded performance is quite strong. Overclock, the score is boosted by 13%, and while this is a decent improvement, it doesn't really help the 7350K close in by a meaningful margin on the more modern Core i5 processors. Before jumping to the gaming and application results, here's a quick look at the PC Mark 8 Creative Benchmark. Here the overclock netted us 9% more performance, resulting in a score of 8,410 points. That's actually higher than the stock clocked Core i5 processors. Still, this is of course a synthetic benchmark, so let's not read too much into those results just yet. Out of the box, the 7350K was surprisingly capable in Gears of War 4, delivering an average of 96 FPS. Overclocked, the frame rate was boosted by 14% to 109 FPS, which was enough to overtake the stock clocked Core i7 2600K. Not a bad result, and it does mean that the overclocked Core i3 processor was 28% faster than the previous generation 6100 model, which makes sense given it has a 30% clock speed advantage. Testing Overwatch saw the overclocked 7350K boost the average frame rate by 16%, allowing it to reach 219 FPS. This made it a good bit faster than the stock Core i5 2500K, but still quite a bit slower than the 4670K. At the stock clock speeds, I did notice occasional stuttering with the 7350K in Battlefield 1. This is despite pushing well over 60 FPS at all times. Overclocking the CPU to 4.8 GHz seemed to solve this, and we're now achieving a 130 FPS average, matching the Core i7 2600K. The last game I tested was the CPU-intensive Watch Dogs 2. Here the 7350K only allowed for an average of 46 FPS out of the box. Dipping down to 37 FPS at times, the game didn't appear to suffer from stuttering issues. That said, stuttering was a major problem with the 2500K at its stock clock speed. Overclocked, we extracted 13% more performance out of the Core i3 processor, and it was now delivering a very smooth experience. Moving on from gaming, we have the Excel Monte Carlo workload, which took the 7350K a total of 7.6 seconds to complete. Overclocking reduced that time to 7.2 seconds, and this is a 6% reduction, but you aren't exactly going to notice it. This also only placed the 7350K alongside the stock 2500K in terms of performance. Okay, so how about content creation on a budget? Once again, we find when overclocked, the 7350K is only able to match the stock 2500K and AMD FX 8370 processors. Clearly, if you're doing any kind of encoding work, you're best off getting a true quad-core processor. As we've come to expect from Intel's Core i3 range, the 7350K is very efficient. Overclocking kills efficiency, and with that added voltage we saw an 81% boost in consumption for a 14% increase in frequency. Similar results can be seen when testing with Prime 95. Here the consumption increased by 66%, placing the once efficient 7350K alongside the much more powerful Core i7 processors in terms of power usage. For the longest time now, myself and many others have been asking Intel to release an unlocked Core i3 processor. Finally the time has come, and I'm starting to think you should be careful what you wish for. Actually, in this case, it really is just a matter of too little, too late. An unlocked Ivy Bridge Core i3 would have been amazing. An unlocked Haswell would have been pretty cool as well. An unlocked Skylake, maybe. But for what's going to be a 2017 release, an unlocked dual core with hyper-threading support is pretty underwhelming. In terms of performance, it isn't exactly slow, though having said that, for the most part it only kept pace with the stock clocked Sandy Bridge chips, which, as I said earlier, they are approaching the 6-year-old mark, and in the life of a CPU this pretty much makes them great grandparents. That kind of performance becomes an issue when you take cost into account, and I'm not just talking about the price of the 7350K, though that in itself could be a real issue as well. The previous generation i3-6320 currently costs $160 US, and we can pretty much guarantee Intel will introduce the 7350K at a $10 to $20 premium. But let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say $10. At $170 US, that is a mighty expensive dual-core processor, and for roughly $10 more you can land the Core i5-6400. Keep in mind we did test the 6600K at its stock frequency, and here it isn't much faster than the 6400, so you can safely assume the 6400 is going to demolish an overclocked 7350K. Making matters worse, the Core i5-6400 doesn't require an aftermarket cooler to achieve maximum performance. The stock box cooler is ample here. It also doesn't require an expensive Z-series motherboard. A cheap H110 board will work fine. Since the Z270 boards are the only models with overclocking support, I have to imagine this is what the 7350K will require. Then throw in another $30 or so for a decent air cooler and you are now head and shoulders above what an entry-level Core i5 setup would cost. Then there's that little matter of power consumption. Overclock those two cores, drink like it's their last night on Earth. So, taking all that into account, what do I think about the new KB Lake Core i3 processor, particularly this unlocked model? Well, I think you guys ought to steer clear of it. Anyway, that's my opinion. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. I'm your host Steve, and I'll catch you guys next time. Hey guys, welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Actually, firstly, let me just say welcome to 2017. I can't wait to see what goodies the tech industry has for us this year. Speaking of tech goodies, last month Corsair announced their new SSD. It's an NVMe SSD series called the Force MP500. The release comes hot on the heels of Samsung's 960 series, so the MP500 really is being thrown in the deep end. At least on paper, that doesn't seem to be a big problem for Corsair, as their new speedy SSD series boasts some pretty impressive specifications. Based on the M22280 form factor, they utilise the PCIe 3.0x4 interface for blistering fast sequential read speeds of 3 GB per second, coupled with an equally impressive write throughput of 2.4 GB per second. What's interesting is that although consumers can purchase the MP500 in one of three capacities, 120GB, 240GB or 480GB, Corsair is claiming the same sequential read and write performance for all three models. That said, there is a rather large discrepancy in input-output performance, with the 120GB version severely lagging behind the larger 240GB and 480GB models. So as you might expect, performance will be down on the 120GB model, so just be aware of that. For testing, we do have the granddaddy, the 480GB model on hand, and that's the biggest, fastest model available in the series at present. So we will be showing best case performance then. What's interesting about the new Force MP500 series, and quite important to note, is the fact they are using MLC NAND memory, and not the cheaper, less durable TLC stuff like the 960 EVO series. This is worth keeping in mind when noting the price, as the 480GB version that we have is retailing for around $325 US or $440 for my fellow Aussies. The 512GB version of the 960 Pro, which also uses MLC NAND, costs $330 US or 450 Aussie. The only possible thorn in Corsair side is the TLC based 960 EVO version. The 500GB model costs just $250 US or 340 Aussie, so it'll be interesting to see how the MP500 compares in terms of performance. Before we jump to the benchmarks, I'd just like to touch on a few more things. Whereas the Samsung models feature a Samsung controller, Corsair has naturally had to rely on a third party. That third party being Phison with their PS5007-E7 controller. So far, there are very few SSDs in the world using this controller, so I'm personally yet to see how it handles. Connected to the controller is Toshiba's 15nm MLC NAND, along with a 512MB DRAM buffer. Please note that the 240GB model features a smaller 256MB buffer, and the 120GB model comes with a 128MB buffer. Currently, AES 256-bit encryption isn't supported, but Corsair does hope to deliver a new firmware update soon to add in support. Finally, all three models are being backed by a 3-year warranty, which isn't bad, though we would have liked to have seen them match Samsung's 5-year warranty. Still, Corsair is claiming a 698TB of written data rating, but of course you only have 3 years to prove them wrong. When it comes to software, the Force MP500 series is backed by the rather ugly Corsair SSD toolbox. It has to be said, I am used to seeing much more polished looking software from Corsair, and I expect the SSD toolbox to see some major upgrades in 2017. Basically, most of the functions aren't compatible with NVMe drives at this point, so MP500 owners can't view the drive's smart status, total host rights, run a secure wipe, change the over-provisioning, or mess with the trim command settings. Technically, the MP500 doesn't require a special driver to work. That said, it does if you want to extract a maximum performance from the drive, and right now Corsair doesn't actually offer an NVMe driver. Samsung recently released a new NVM Express driver which greatly improved performance under Windows 10 and 8.1. The problem being that these operating systems by default enable a write cache buffer known as the Force Unit Access command, which dramatically reduces performance. This command is a conservative approach taken by Microsoft to ensure data integrity in case of sudden power loss. However, from Windows 8 onwards, Microsoft also incorporated an automatic flush command to ensure data integrity, but they simultaneously maintain the much older Force Unit Access command in the standard driver settings. This redundancy means that the write speeds are significantly inhibited due to an unnecessary write verification process. By manually disabling the command, the write performance does reach expected levels. However, manually manipulating drive properties isn't very user-friendly, which is obviously why Samsung developed their own NVMe driver to do this automatically. Hopefully Corsair will follow suit and do the same. Anyway, by this point I think we've pretty much covered the meat and potatoes of it. Let's get to that juicy steak. I of course mean the benchmarks. I'm just going to breeze through a few graphs and then show you the Force MP500 going head to head with the Samsung 960 EVO using an external capture device to show you real-time performance. Right, so first up we have the AS SSD benchmark sequential results. Here the MP500 looks good despite being slower than its Samsung rivals. The read bandwidth was down 15% when compared to the 960 Pro, while the write performance was disappointingly 36% lower. The 4K 64 thread performance was also down on the Samsung drives. Here the MP500 was 44% slower than the 960 Pro when comparing the write performance. Again, the MP500's numbers were respectable, but just not as large as we would have liked. The drive's access times are on par with the 960 Pro, so that's great to see. Interestingly, both of these drives though are slower than the older 950 Pro. Here we have a few quick copy tests, and we find the MP500 struggling to compete with last season's 950 Pro. In fact, while the program copy performance was much the same, the MP500 was almost 30% slower in moving our game data. Then, compared to Samsung's 960 series, it was a bit of a bloodbath if I'm honest. The last graph we're going to look at shows us the 7-zip file extraction performance. Again, the MP500 does come in well under what we were hoping for, taking 93 seconds to complete the workload, with a throughput of just 383 megabytes per second. Surprisingly, that actually makes it slower than the Kingston Predator SSD. First up, for the side-by-side comparisons, we have everyone's favourite, the boot test. This one's pretty simple. We measured the time it took for the system to load. Starting the test as the Windows 10 logo appeared, we then stopped the clock the moment the desktop loaded. This took Corsair's MP500 just 4 seconds, an impressive time indeed. Meanwhile, the 960 EVO limped over the finish line a few seconds later, and given the results just seen previously, I'm surprised to see the MP500 winning in this test. Want to be the first one into every game? Well, a snappy SSD is the best way to achieve that. The 960 EVO took just 8 seconds to complete the Call of Duty Infinite Warfare level load time test. Meanwhile, the MP500 was slightly slower, taking 11 seconds. Not much in it though, and this is the kind of performance I was expecting to see. It also makes the MP500 a good bit faster than your typical SATA SSD as well. Those of you who fire up Premiere Pro CC multiple times a day like I do will appreciate how quick an NVMe drive makes things. The 960 EVO takes just 5 seconds to load Premiere Pro, while the MP500 took 9 seconds. Again, even at 9 seconds, the MP500 is a good bit faster than your average SATA SSD. Finally, we have the 7-zip 38GB file extraction test, and although we have already looked at the performance in this test previously in graph form, this is how the MP500 and 960 EVO compare in a real-time comparison. As seen previously when loading Windows, applications and games, the MP500 isn't that much slower than the 960 EVO. Hell, it was actually faster getting into Windows. However, when we do start to turn up the heat with some heavy write traffic,